President-elect Donald Trump took one last opportunity on the eve of his inauguration to celebrate his election victory at a rally in Washington, D.C.
And he also talked about his goals for his second term in the White House, which includes many announcements that he is expected to make later today. Scott LaDeur from North Central Michigan College continues our discussion about what comes next. Scott, we're already hearing about executive orders. One report I heard this morning said there may be as many as 200 in the opening day or days of a Trump presidency. What do you make of all this?
Yeah, that is, again, not uncommon. Most presidents, when they come into office as newly inaugurated, often have a whole slew of executive orders that they're ready to sign. And some tend to be kind of more performative, executive orders that instruct agencies to begin looking at things to kind of get the policy machine working. And others are more kind of substantive in nature, things that presidents have unilateral discretion to do. So the fact that the Trump people have telegraphed that executive orders are going to be some of the first things they do is not uncommon, mostly because it's faster and it can show the supporters and the media that something is getting done, and much faster than going through Congress for legislation, which he will have to do for many things as well, but that takes a long time.
Now, Scott, there have been a lot of promises made on stuff that's going to happen day one. Day one seems to almost have been a motto since the election results came in.
It's going to be a really busy day.
It's going to be an incredibly, if everything that has been said is going to be handled today, this is going to be a jam-packed day. I don't know how we're even going to have time for much of an inauguration. So out of all of these, what do you think is actually going to be focused on? What are the real priorities here? Because everything can't be a priority because then nothing is.
Right. Again, I think that many of the orders today, or many of the President-elect Trump's actions, will be based on this idea of getting the executive branch policymaking process going. I don't think there will be kind of hard and fast results, except maybe in a few areas, right? President-elect Trump has made a big deal about extending the time window for TikTok to be sold. And so that might have some real teeth. There's some immigration actions he could take on day one that might change certain policies here and there. He has a lot of unilateral control around tariffs. And so I'm interested to see what he might do with respect to those on day one. But he also made a lot of promises during the campaign that the war in Ukraine would end on day one and that other things would happen on day one. While it's possible those things might happen, I would put them in a very, very low probability on the first day.
I'm curious what your take is on things like the potential pardons for those folks arrested in connection with January 6th. You've also got more promises to help with the victims of the California wildfires and potentially sending more money out west, border security. And also another thing I found interesting was talk about releasing the records of these mysterious drone sightings, the JFK assassination. I mean, just a lot of things that make you go, all right, is this going to happen?
So pardons are a kind of unrestricted presidential power. So if President-elect Trump wanted to issue pardons on day one, he certainly could. As for sending more resources to California or border actions, certainly there's a lot of border actions that can take place, and aid to my guess is I doubt that President Biden is sitting on aid to California and just not sending it. So I guess I would question whether that is, how much substance is behind that. As to the JFK and drone sighting stuff, like the last 3 presidents have come to office talking about we're going to release all these files, and yet somehow the files never get released. Trump was in office for 4 years and could have declassified all that stuff. So I guess maybe I'm a little skeptical of those actions on day one.
That's still, even so, that's a lot of work to do. That's a lot of changes we could see within a very, very short time frame. Now, how do you see the next kind of 4 years playing out, particularly with some of the cabinet picks that have come in? Because what people have said about the previous administration is there were a lot of checks and balances that some would say, slowed Trump down to get the things done he wanted. Some would say kept him from going too far too fast. The incoming cabinet picks aren't going to necessarily be the same individuals. So What do you foresee in regards to that in the coming 4 years, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, you bring up an interesting point, right? Like Trump enters in 2024 in a much different environment than in 2016. So in 2024, he won the popular vote, which is again not how we determine the presidency, but is an important psychological kind of factor in presidential action. And he comes in with a firmer control over the GOP. I mean, I think you were right to say that in 2016, the GOP had a lot of factions, and not all of them were kind of on board with President Trump. A much firmer control this time, reflected, as you say, in a lot of his picks for the cabinet, who seem to be more in line, I mean, more or less, with his view of government power. However, the cabinet is not everything. I mean, I think if we've seen anything over the last 60 years or so, it's the weakening of the cabinet and the strengthening of the White House staff. And so to the extent that the White House staff, senior advisors, all of the czars that kind of presidents tend to appoint over policy areas, they often have much more power than cabinet officials who kind of are left to tend to their knitting a lot of times as the White House drives the bus on policy. So I think we might, I think you might see, as you suggest, far fewer barriers in the path of President Trump, but I think that's going to be far more reflected in a White House staff that is, in tune with the president's political instincts. However, the president-elect also enters in a period where he has an extremely narrow congressional majority, only 2 votes in the House and 3 votes in the Senate, and he arrives as an instant lame duck. And so parts of the GOP will be saying, who will lead the party come 2026, come 2028? And there may be jockeying and infighting and battles around that, because this is the peril of what Trump has made the GOP, which is the big tent. There's a lot of factions in the GOP, and while they all like Trump, they all may not know where to go after Trump leaves. And so the big tent is great at winning elections. It is poor at either following through on an ideology or imposing a policy agenda, because in order to win the election, you need lots of voices. But then when you start running the government, all those voices tend to disagree. So while he may have a more coherent support staff in the White House who might be better to execute his ideas, the formal machinery of government might still be subject to the same levels of infighting that we saw 8 years ago, if only because Trump will leave in 4 years and the GOP has to figure out who's the heir to Trump and where do we go from here.
Well, Scott, always appreciate having you on. Always appreciate your insight. Thanks so much for being with us from Petoskey today, North Central Michigan College. Good to have you.
Thanks much. Stay warm, guys.
Stay warm.
Yeah, you too.